Good morning to all, Your Royal Highness, Secretary-General, dear panelists and participants. Warm welcome to all of you this morning. My name is Elsa Pilichowski, and I'm the Director for Public Governance at the OECD. I will be moderating this session. Today's seminar aims at launching and discussing the key findings of our OECD report, Governance for Youth, Trust and International Justice, Fit for All Generations. Participants today include delegates from the OECD Public Governance Committee, policymakers and representatives from youth and elderly associations. I would just like to remind you that the event this morning is live streamed on YouTube and recording will be available on the OECD website. Please all join me in welcoming the Secretary-General of the OECD, Mr. Angel Gurria, as well as Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands, who will deliver the opening remarks. Thank you very much. Mr. Gurria, Secretary-General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elsa, and Royal Highness Princess Laurentien, Parliamentary State Secretary Marx, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my great pleasure to launch the OECD report, Governance for Youth, Trust and Intergenerational Justice. Now, the subtitle is Fit for All Generations, and then it has a question mark. So we have to resolve that question mark. We have to see whether we take it away or what do we do with the question mark. This report comes at a particularly difficult time for our economies, our societies, and for young people around the globe. Young people shouldered much of the economic consequences of the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. The OECD's share of youth not in employment, education, or training, the so-called NEETs, rose to 18%, and youth unemployment increased by 20%, leaving 1 in 8 youths in poverty. Now, once again, young people are at risk of becoming the biggest economic casualties of the current crisis. Youth employment in the OECD fell by 5.6 percentage points. It fell to 36.3% in the second quarter of this year, which is when the crisis was worse. The sharpest drop among all the population groups, leaving behind many young graduates with uncertain job prospects. We're also suffering a deficit of trust. In more than half of the OECD countries, young people trust their governments less than they did in 2006. The young are also less likely to vote or engage in political parties than their parents, again, because of the lack of trust. But all is not lost. As you will hear from State Secretary Marx, the pandemic has also shown us the importance of intergenerational solidarity. Despite the challenges that they face, young people were among the most active in fostering social cohesion, in building societal resilience. It is also the young who help the elderly in isolated care facilities, who volunteer in charities, who keep harnessing digital tools and leading social movements to demand greater ambition when tackling climate change. As we address these challenges together, we must not let the COVID-19 crisis result in a generation lockdown. Let me highlight 3 key messages from our report. First, investments in youth-responsive policies and services pay off. where young people succeed in their transition to autonomy, societies and economies will harness their potential productive. You know, let me just say that it's intuitive. If you bet on the young people and they do better, everybody wins. The economy, society, everybody gains. However, across the OECD, only 20% of national youth strategies are what you could call participatory, budgeted, monitored, evaluated. That means there's a follow-up where you're monitoring the results, and then you do something about adjusting the policies. We need to make sure our policies are more inclusive, are more transparent, are more accountable, are more responsive to youth. Second, we must address the gaps in young people's participation and representation in public life. Today, 22% of parliamentarians in the OECD are below the age of 40, while the age of 20 to 40-year-olds in the total population stands at 34%. So clearly, the ones that are under 40 in parliament are underrepresented, 34% in terms of the population, 22% present in parliaments. Our report finds that youth will express higher satisfaction with policy outcomes when they are engaged more systematically in policymaking, when they are part of the process. Yet, only 1 in 4 youth organizations surveyed were satisfied with the opportunities to participate in public life. So this is a big deficit. More must be done. And third, the COVID-19 crisis risks exacerbating inequalities among young people and among the different age cohorts. Governments need to assess, governments need to understand, to use the evidence about the distributional impact of their laws, their policies, and their budgets. Much work remains to be done to promote intergenerational justice in policymaking. Initiatives like Germany's Youth Check and the Netherlands Generation Test are great examples of such efforts aimed at promoting policies that are fit for youth, but also, as the subtitle of our publications is, are they fit for all generations? So, dear friends, Royal Highness and State Secretary, thank you for joining us. Young people have a key role to play in helping build back better. This has now become a battle cry for the post-COVID period. But building back better doesn't happen by itself. We have to make it happen. So let's ensure that youth receives the support that they deserve, that they expect. The OECD is more committed than ever to helping countries pursue a more inclusive, more sustainable, greener, resilient recovery that works for all generations, and that we can actually remove the question mark from the title of our publication today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I would like now to give the floor to Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands. Royal Highness, now you have the floor.
Wonderful to be here, and Mr. Secretary-General, thank you very much. I'm so pleased. We would be giving each other a big hug when we were really in the same room, but we'll do it virtually. And I'd like to pick up on a few points that the Secretary-General has mentioned and has highlighted in this really formidable report, which really lays the basis for further thinking of all countries around this issue. I've been working on this issue for the last decade, ever since the COP15 conference in Copenhagen, and I'm currently working with the Dutch government to develop a structural and cohesive approach on youth empowerment, participation, and representation. And I would actually call it an emancipation movement that we need and that we actually should embrace. And why is emancipation important? Because what happens with emancipation, rather than just participation, is that with emancipation, the sitting order needs to actually recognize the need to listen to the concerns and ideas of young people. And that is absolutely crucial. Young people, we cannot ask them to actually start disrupting the system. We should open the gates and allow them to do that. And I believe that the 8 principles in the assessment framework that OECD has developed, which is in the report, really provide excellent guidance on all the key elements that are crucial for that. Now, I'd like to highlight a few things from my work over the last decade, and particularly now working with the Dutch government, that putting this into practice is necessary, it's doable, but I also give a warning that it requires stamina, and that is particularly, so it also requires a long-term thinking, which is challenging in a time when we're looking in COVID for quick solutions. And we should also guard ourselves that we don't think that we find the solutions that are short-term, but that for the longer term, it actually does not work. So I'd like to highlight 3 points. The first one is what we're doing actually now, because I'm developing a whole participatory process in practice, is that when you truly listen to young people, we should dare to actually unravel what I would call the intergenerational misunderstanding. And that has a great influence on trust. I feel that the current generation of decision makers and young people, they speak a different language and they don't really understand each other because key notions are so different for both. For example, for my generation, I'm 54 years old, the community is the starting point, and I, as an individual, fit into that community. In that case, representation is fine for me, and I feel heard as an individual because that's the rules of the game that I grew up with. For young people who live also through a digital age, the individual is the starting point, and hence representation may not be the answer of actually feeling heard in society. So we should really, and that's what we're going to do in the Netherlands, unravel and understand and do research about, do we really understand notions of participation, representation, and do we have the same understanding of democracy? That's the first thing. The second thing is in a point that the Secretary-General also mentioned, and that is indeed the incredibly important element of a participative process. It is the only way to develop sustainable solutions and not paper solutions. And that is easier said than done. I live that every day. The wonderful thing is that I, as an independent outsider, have the mandate to work together with the system, with the government, to actually develop a whole infrastructure. But it requires open-mindedness. It requires that if you really are participatory, it requires, and you put youth in the driver's seat to help think through what is it that we want, you will get disruption. And at micro level, I would advise any government working on this, make sure that the people you put into this domain actually get the mandate politically, but also in the civil service, as well as the competencies to embrace this kind of disruption of the system. And that is easier said than done, but that mandate actually should really come from the top so that the people in the teams, and I work with really excellent people in the Ministry of Interior Affairs, have the mandate to allow this disruption in a harmonious way. And that is the process that I am lucky enough to help lead. The third final thing is, I would actually say, build infrastructures and not just high profile paper solutions. There are, on the basis of this perhaps old-fashioned notions of representation and what is it that needs fixing, the thing that we should not do is build paper solutions. And I am really excited to work with a whole range of youth organizations now, that we want to start working on a plan to really develop the right infrastructure for youth representation in the Netherlands. And I think that there's some excellent examples in, for example, some Nordic countries that we can build upon. And the key thing here is financing. We should not forget about the financing, and this should both at local level and at national level. We have to start finding creative ways to finance a proper infrastructure for youth representation. It should be inclusive. It should not just be the selected few, and this is also a message to youth organizations. Keep working on being inclusive and include all kinds of young people and voices from society. And after all, I believe that this is in everybody's interest. So we should also look at creative ways of bringing in the philanthropy world, bringing in perhaps the private sector to help fund this. Of course, always remaining independent, but it is in everybody's interest to have future-oriented democracies in which young people feel heard and engaged, and really we should put our money where our mouth is. In conclusion, I believe that intergenerational justice is symbolic for the way we govern and structure our societies more broadly. Are we willing to share power? A few final remarks. Intergenerational justice for me is a need to have, not a nice to have, because I believe that the future of our planet and the future of our democracies depend on it. The second point is, finally, it requires some long-term thinking, a fundamental shift in how we view young people, not just as the citizens of tomorrow, but as equal citizens today. And it requires a willingness and ability to redesign our decision-making processes to make young people actually co-creators of our societies and economies, and not just the voices from the outside. They are here, and we need those voices. And I believe that we need those voices from very early age, from 10, 12 years old. And let's remember that in the end, intergenerational justice, it's down, I believe, to mutual respect, deep listening, and again, a willingness to share power. Certainly at this time with COVID, young people are really the ones suffering, who live in small houses, small places, and the well-being of all young people is at heart and for the future of our societies. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I really look forward to working with the OECD to build on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Princess Laurentien. Thank you very much for these inspiring thoughts, and we look forward to continuing our work on that. I think we're all grateful for your passionate engagement. And I also think that we will have to work together on these, on how the concepts of emancipation and representation at the same time are evolving with time and with technology as well. Now I invite all the participants to listen to the recorded message from Mrs. Karen Marx, who's the Parliamentary State Secretary from the Ministry, Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth in Germany. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, dear OECD, dear friends of youth, the COVID-19 pandemic has deeply disrupted our societies and economies. While future prospects remain uncertain, young people have displayed great resilience. Our younger generations have demonstrated that they are deeply engaged in bringing relief to those that need it most. They helped in many ways in projects like volunteer services or in youth organizations. Yet, these examples are not enough to develop the policies we need. We need hard evidence and systematic analysis. The OECD Global Report on Youth Empowerment and Intergenerational Justice provides valuable insight into the daily life of young people. It shows that public governance is of great importance in supporting their transition towards an independent life. For this reason, the German federal government developed a joint youth strategy. It underlines that good youth policy must involve young people in decisions affecting them. The OECD report highlights the added value of such a youth strategy, and it raises questions related to resources and solidarity between different generations. Because of increasingly good life conditions in OECD nations, we all tend to live longer. The relative weight of older generations will increase, and so will their demand for resources. But our aging societies need young people, their ideas, their commitment, and their potential. We need to explore the existing inequalities across generations, and we need to look for solutions and a suitable distribution of resources. As one step, our ministry has put the youth check in place. The youth check assesses the impact of legislation on young people aged between 12 and 27 years. Young people contribute in many ways to our society. Therefore, we need to give them a greater say in all matters affecting them. For us, that is a central conclusion of the OECD report and a confirmation of our approach in youth policy.
Thank you very much to the State Secretary for recording this message. With that, I would like to thank the State Secretary, Princess Laurentien, as well as the Secretary-General for opening this webinar. And we will now move to the panel discussion. Thank you very much to the two of you for being present this morning. So now we open the panel discussion on how to make policies fit for all generations. We have a great panel of high-level speakers with some people who have waken up at 5 a.m. this morning and others for whom it's about 11 p.m. And we thank them dearly for making it anyway to our event today. Let me first just remind you of what the Secretary-General has just said about young people who are being hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis in terms of education, employment, and mental well-being. To remind also you that one of the main findings of our report at the OECD is that only 46% of young people expressed trust in their government in 2019. Their perception of having a say in politics, their participation in elections, and their representation in state institutions have barely improved over time. So our report identifies a strong business case to act. When youth were consulted and engaged, they were more satisfied with the government's performance in public service areas, as Princess Laurentien has just reminded us. So what should be the role of the state, and what are the tools civil servants can apply today? I would like to ask first Alexandra Robinson, who is the global president of ISEC, and who's the one waking up very early this morning, the following question. So ISEC is an international youth organization, for those who don't know it, who represents youth in over 120 countries. So Alexandra, what do you think governments can do to regain the trust of their young people in the current context?
Yes, hello, and thank you for the question. Hello to everyone attending today, this morning, and taking the time to review the findings of this really interesting and compelling report. So as a young person myself representing a youth-led organization, I think it's really important that we're starting this conversation speaking about rebuilding trust. We know, and we've just mentioned opening this panel today, that it's a problem that youth are facing and have been facing, and that it's only now being further amplified by the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. As ISIC, we recently launched just this week our Global Youth Speak Report, which is a global youth insight survey. And we did find that youth reported that among a list of possible stakeholders, the most frequently selected as the one able to influence society is government. So we know that there were times, and there are an understanding among the youth population, that government has a significant ability to influence society and make the changes that they want to see. But we know that even with that belief, the trust is not always there, and sometimes in the current context, it has been eroded. In a recent survey from the ILO that complements a lot of the OECD's findings, 1 in 3 young people reported that since the COVID-19 pandemic has begun, they've actually seen a significant decrease in their ability to participate in public affairs, which has logistical and safety related reasons, but it also shows that sometimes we fail to institutionalize the participation of youth in our institutions, in our processes, and our public affairs. And so when we look to that, there's a lot of really strong frameworks about how to have meaningful youth engagement. And that would be my call to action for governments to rebuild trust with young people, is to be very mindful of what is meaningful youth engagement. So many times, unfortunately, young people are given the opportunity to participate as figureheads or as tokenistic approaches to youth engagement. And meaningful youth engagement looks like youth-initiated partnerships, youth-initiated leadership. It looks like youth-led organizing and governing. It means that young people have a central role in the system structure, in driving programmatic and strategic decisions. And frameworks like the OECD's assessment for national youth strategies highlights that, the need for multifaceted, gender-inclusive, age-inclusive, monitored and accountable youth strategies. And young people know the difference. They are able to understand when their engagement in public affairs is meaningful, it's authentic, and it's actually inclusive of their voice and their competency to steer their society in a direction that's fit for all. And so that'd be my call to action for governments, is really to consider what is meaningful and what is tokenistic youth engagement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra. I think this is important. The word meaningful, we will work on it. I think meaningful youth engagement makes a lot of sense to work on it from a civil engagement perspective for young people. Now to take it a little bit further, our data, the OECD data, also shows that across a number of areas, young people find it increasingly difficult to achieve some of the classical milestones of adulthood, such as financial independence. I think Princess Laurentien mentioned emancipation. I think it overlaps in terms of thinking. Currently, 76% of OECD countries have an operational national youth strategy in place to deliver on the needs of young people. However, the report finds that only 20% of these strategies are fully participatory, budgeted, monitored, and evaluated. And I think, Alexandra, this means meets your concern about token versus meaningful. So even among top performing countries, challenges persist in coordinating across different ministries, delivering for the vulnerable, and understanding how policies and budget allocations affect young people opportunities. So I would like to ask Mrs. Mary Brown, who's the director of the Child Wellbeing Unit in New Zealand, and whom I thank again for staying up late with us. From your experience, Mary, in preparing the child and youth wellbeing strategy in New Zealand, why is it worth investing in the quality of youth policy?
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to all of you, to Your Royal Highness, to our leaders from all around the world. It's great to be part of this conversation. If I were younger, I'd be just going out now probably, so it's not that late really, for a youth-focused event. In New Zealand, we've taken a life cycle approach to youth policy work, and it has been led at the very highest levels by our Prime Minister and her colleagues. About a year ago, the Prime Minister launched our Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy, which sets out a shared understanding of what matters, what's important for child and youth wellbeing. And that was informed very much by engaging with children and young people themselves, a nationwide engagement process. It outlines what the government is doing and will do over the next few years. It's a long-term strategy. It outlines what policies and actions it's the government's committing to put in place. It also outlines how others can help. And it was supported by significant new investment through the last 2 budget rounds in New Zealand, as well as the special COVID fund more recently. So effectively, the strategy creates a framework which drives all of government policy and service development for children and young people. And it helps align our collective efforts. That's been a really important feature of it. It's something that we can hang everything else off, and it creates that shared language for others to use, including players outside of government. It's also underpinned by legislation. And there's regular reporting requirements to the public on the progress that's been made, and a requirement also to refresh or review the strategy every 3 years after further engagement with young people, so it can deal with emerging and new issues and trends. We didn't anticipate COVID, for example, when it was written, but I'm sure the next iteration of the strategy will be much more COVID focused. And in the meantime, our actions, of course, are pivoting, to use that common word now, to focus on COVID. So it creates a level of transparency and political accountability that we've never had before, and it means that successive governments will have the same requirements on them. Many of the initiatives underway have been scaled up by COVID, so it's since COVID. So it stood us in really good stead, having a strong evidence-based framework, high-level leadership, and really good working relationships and partnerships across government and with youth sector leaders, of course, that we could draw on for our COVID response and act really quickly. And many of the initiatives got scaled up very quickly, such as initiatives to improve transitions from school to offer free trades and apprenticeship training. So those programs were in place, but they were able to be scaled up quickly. Similarly, wellbeing in school initiatives. We knew that many children and young people would come to school very anxious after our lockdown ended. So we were able to really scale up the initiatives around supporting their broader wellbeing in schools. The strategy has a really strong focus on youth participation and on hearing the voices of young people in all decisions that affect them. That was a really strong theme that came through engagement, was the right to be heard, and also that what government wasn't just as important what government did, but how government provided services, and young people wanted to be actively involved in shaping those. So one of our key focuses in the COVID response is to build on that and ensure youth-led action. There's a lot of things to build on from our initial COVID response. A lot of young people demonstrating really fantastic leadership and initiative and innovation, and there's new funding available to help build their capacity and their resilience as we go forward. I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I think we're all inspired by what's happening in New Zealand on many fronts, including on youth. One also important point that I draw from what you're saying is that, and that derived from what you're saying, is that there were things that were taking place before the COVID crisis, that the COVID crisis has just emphasized and made bigger. Both in terms of issues and challenges, but also in terms of policies to address those. Another point that I would like to take from this panel is the fact that many of today's heated political debates are often framed as intergenerational challenges. We can think about climate change and the youth who was in the street at one point, or the sustainability of the public deficits, for example. During the present crisis, we've seen several instances of intergenerational solidarity that basically show that that there remain a lot of solidarity across generations in spite of the heated political debates. However, the question remains on how governments can foster intergenerational justice, dialogue, solidarity beyond the current crisis. The report finds that demographics alone do not determine how governments allocate public resources across different age cohorts. Instead, policies, institutions, culture also matter quite a bit. It also finds that countries in which age-related inequalities are small, overall life satisfaction is higher, and it's already been pointed out in this panel this morning. This is, of course, a strong business case to address such inequalities. A number of OECD countries have turned to establishing government-wide legal frameworks, oversight institutions, and new public administration tools to deliver fair policy outcomes across generations. Some of these efforts date back to the 1990s, such as the Committee for the Future in Finland, or have been elaborated more recently, such as you just pointed to it, Mary, the Wellbeing budget in New Zealand. I would like now to ask Mr. Mathieu Kouhachi, Secretary-General of the Age Platform Europe, the following question. Age Platform Europe is representing the interest of the elderly people in Europe. What are your expectations from governments to ensure response and recovery plans to address this crisis without leaving any generation behind?
Hello, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to this discussion on behalf of the organizations representing older people. I would like to share with you some thoughts on this in this area on how to strengthen, how to use the intergenerational solidarity as a solution to the current crisis. Maybe let me to start first by saying that different generations may have different experiences, sensibilities, expectations, and this is per se a natural thing. Yet it was very eloquently said by Her Royal Highness, first we need as well to understand the motivations of different generations, and then comes intergenerational solidarity, which should build on these diverse experiences and sensitivities in a harmonious way, rather than opposing them as mutually exclusive. It is not a question, I think, in the context of this crisis, but also broadly speaking, we should not to choose between the interests, needs, or aspirations of one or another generation. Actually, generations complement each other in their vision of society, but also in the solutions that different age groups bring to shape our societies. Therefore, it is the responsibility of our governments, of all decision makers, to avoid antagonism between age cohorts and population groups as much as possible. I think that in the global context of what's going on right now in everywhere, in all parts of the world, there is already enough populism which tries actually to pit people against each other. Therefore, I would say this is a call from us as Age Platform Europe, that to all policymakers, but also to all of us, to build the resilience of our societies based on what unites us, rather what separates people. The spirit of solidarity during the pandemic crisis, it was also mentioned in the opening panel by the Secretary-General, it should guide policies and responses beyond the crisis. Here, I would like to make a very brief reference to a very interesting study that was recently issued by the Eurofound. It's a survey called Living, Working, and COVID-19, which aims to capture, let's say, the far-reaching implications of the pandemic for the labor market, for working conditions, and quality of life across the EU. And this survey shows very interesting findings. Young respondents, indeed, they experience more loneliness, tension, and depression than people aged 50 and over. At the same time, life satisfaction actually improves for oldest and the youngest respondents more than for the middle age group. And what's even more interesting is that important differences exist within the same age group. Among the young, those with lower education levels, were more likely to feel excluded than those with the higher education. Women were also somehow more likely to feel excluded than men. What these findings shows, it's actually that we need to focus, when we speak about solidarity, we should to focus on the inequalities that exist both within and between generations. To leave no one behind, governments must address the specific needs of each age and population group. And actually, your report already points out this very, very clearly. So our governments should reform the social protection systems, but also the labor market in a way which, well, taking the perspective of life cycle. This is the only way to prevent that people will accumulate different inequalities on handicaps throughout their lives. So to conclude, what I found the most, let's say, interesting as way forward, as solutions in your report is, for example, this idea indeed to foster the political commitment to act upon inequalities both within and among generations, the need for age disaggregated data, the evidence to make visible what inequalities are within the same cohort, age cohort, but also in between. The idea to of an impact assessment of policies from the perspective of generations. The example that was already mentioned of the generation test. Also the idea of coordination in policy making in between all different ministries, departments, dealing with all different policies, finances, social affairs, environment, youth, and older people, but these policies need to be coordinated. We are absolutely in the need of a holistic approach to all reforms, and age diversity in public life and decision making, absolutely, as it was already said. And maybe to conclude, I would again like to refer to what was said by Her Highness, Royal Highness, when she said that solidarity between generations is based on the mutual respect, on the capacity to listen each other, and also on the capacity to share the power. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. And this is a really important call. I think putting resilience of our system at the core of the work that we carry out for all generations is really an important concept, and we should all reflect about that. Our report also finds that in more than half of OECD countries for which data is available, young people volunteered more than all groups in 2019, and this is probably, although we don't have the data yet, even further, even more during the COVID crisis, and even more towards helping out the older generations. So we all realize that governments can and should leverage youth mobilization to ensure societal resilience. And yet the report shows that both governments and youth organizations across OECD countries highlight numerous challenges in the youth volunteering and youth work sectors, including a lack of strategic planning, lack of resources, and a certain lack of coordination. So there is a very strong case for governments to invest in this area. And the report also finds that in countries with a national program for youth volunteering, national program that is in place, young people tend to volunteer more. So this is now a question for Florencia van Out, Head of Unique Director-General for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture at the European Commission, whom we thank also warmly for attending this panel this morning. So the European Union, through its youth strategy, European Solidarity Corps and Erasmus program that we all know about, has quite promoted youth volunteering and youth work. So from your experience, what lessons should governments consider when they try to encourage youth volunteering and youth work?
Thank you for inviting me, and let me start with first congratulate OECD with their very impressive report, because there is this saying, what's get measured gets done, and you bring in a lot of very important evidence to show that it's worth investing in youth policy and that it pays off. And this is important because it's, of course, very often seen as a soft policy area to support young people is important. That behind gives a big additional source of evidence that will be very useful. And I invite everyone to actively use these figures in their plea to step up the bar in youth participation and youth support and youth policies. And indeed, in the EU, we're also convinced youth policy matters. That's why we have since 2020 backed up by young Elsa now since 2 years, also the European Solidarity Corps.
Florentia, we cannot hear you very well. Maybe turn off your camera.
Can you hear me better like this?
Yes.
Is it better? I will look very close to the camera, but that's the price to pay then, perhaps. We have, since about 20 years, we have our policies and our programs. And I was saying the situation in the different member states of the EU is very diverse. And there is not necessarily one recipe that is better than another, because the volunteering and youth work is strongly embedded in social and cultural habits and structures of society. And these youth support services have very much grown embedded into how the countries organize their civil society and how they support young people. But the beauty of working together in EU context is that we can bring member states together, look at the different practices, also discuss them together, and on that basis, everybody can learn. So we invest a lot in bringing member states together to discuss good practices or perhaps also bad practices, so that everybody can benefit and we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach, but member states can take back useful lessons and implement them in a way that fits their national or even local structures. We do support these activities, of course, at an EU level through our programs. So you already mentioned the Erasmus Plus program, which I guess is very well known. And within that, we do support youth work capacity building, exactly to also allow not only member state officials, but also practitioners to go out in the field, meet other youth workers in different countries, and acting as an eye-opener, learning about skills and taking those initiatives back home. We also have the European Solidarity Corps that allows young people to go on a volunteering mission abroad. We like to think that solidarity with others, with other generations, with other people doesn't necessarily stop at national borders, but can also work in a European wider context. And I very much like to think of it as a win-win-win situation. Normally we say win-win, but in these cases, the young people, by going abroad, they can learn more than just the soft skills you would learn in volunteering. But on top, they get an intercultural experience. They can learn their languages. And by being far away from home, you are really put to the test. And this tends to be a very beneficial and enriching experience for our participants. It's also a win, of course, for those who benefit from those volunteers who come and help them and serve their needs, because they will get benefits. They will also get an intercultural experience and meet somebody from another European country, not even there. So it's the communities that win, it's the young people that win, and in the end, it's Europe that wins by having a thriving promotion. And I already heard that with laws, young people volunteer more. So we hope to our programs to contribute. And as everybody has mentioned, COVID, let me also say a word about that. And we have seen that when COVID came about, of course, many of our volunteers were far away in different countries. And we have done our best to support them, to help them repatriate, or when their plans were changed, that they could still go on. But we have seen also many who said, no, I don't want to go home, and who were abroad, stopping their mission and instead dedicating their time to sewing mouth masks, going shopping, doing some online activities with children who were grounded at home and so on, which was quite a feat when you're abroad in a different country as a volunteer to be able to get active in a community, to engage in this. And that's something we're really proud of. And we can really see this works. When you look at our indicators that we have on the experience that participants have with these programs, they're very positive. They feel they really learn. And they also feel better about themselves, about solidarity, and about, they feel also more part of Europe. So indeed, we can only encourage this kind of practices. And from the EU side, we're there also to support with the evidence and the experience and the funds that we have.
Thank you very much, Laurentia. And we know how much the EU invests in youth, of course. Now we're going to turn to the short Q&A session. I would like to remind attendees that they can type their questions in the Q&A box or in the chat function, and we collect them. For now, we have two questions. One is from Amy Odon. This is a question for Alexandra Robinson. How can we connect with the disconnected youth and, for instance, young people who don't have access to the internet?
Absolutely. That's a really important question. And I actually did, understand that in the OECD report, there were similar findings that institutions, I think it was as many as 1 in 2, report facing a similar issue, how to engage, disadvantaged or more difficult to access youth populations. And I think that we've noticed that ourselves in the work we do with young people, especially in COVID-19, where it's so easy for us to then rely on our virtual and technological communication channels to reach people. I mean, today, this panel is a wonderful example of that it's wonderful that it can bridge the gaps of physical distance between us, but it's not necessarily always a fully inclusive platform. So I think acknowledging that and recognizing that is a really important first step. And then I think that a lot of the responsibility there for how we can move forward through this issue, it's the people that are on the ground. It's those organizations that were already trying to reach those populations before, bringing them into the network of engaged organizations. So your nonprofit organizations, civil society organizations that were already on the ground trying to reach these populations, how can we bring them in and hear from them the resources that are needed? And that aligns to a lot of the findings we've had as ISIC. Young people report access to resources and access to opportunity as some of the main barriers for them having the meaningful career that they want to have in their life and the impact that they aspire to have. And so it's often a lack of accessible resources. And many times institutions and governments have these resources available, earmarked, set aside for engaging youth populations, but it's just not trickling down to those that maybe need it most. And so again, speaking to those organizations that have experience, expertise, a track record of engaging those disenfranchised populations, I think we have to start there, listen to the people that know what they need, and then tailor our interventions to reach them best.
Thank you very much. We have a second question from Kais Altobi to Mary Brown. What can governments do to support younger people reach senior positions in government?
Again, a very good question, and I'm not sure I have the total solution to that. And in New Zealand, we do have a lot of internship type positions, and particularly for graduates to try out to see whether they would like to work in the government sector, and that's proved very popular and really useful in terms of ensuring we're rebalancing the profile of our state sector and hearing younger people, and within government, even at the leadership level, there's a strong focus now on actually not just recruiting but retaining young people and understanding what would incentivize them, what a good workplace looks like for them, not assuming that actually what has gone on before and what makes for a good workplace for someone my age is going to be at all attractive to new recruits coming in. So that's part of it. We also have a lot of advisory groups and groups working alongside government that are youth-led, which is not the same thing as having a senior position in government, but many young people don't prefer that that independence, I guess, and ability to comment and critique on ideas as they are being formulated, as opposed to being part of the formal state sector itself. So that again, and again in COVID, proved incredibly helpful because we could tap in very quickly to networks of networks. I guess they will bring their own networks, and through them we were able to identify emerging issues and needs, and including to answer the link back to the previous question, those who didn't have access to digital devices, ensuring that they actually were contacted by trusted networks is really important. Yeah, it's a work in progress, I would say, for us. We certainly haven't solved how to actually to have more youth-led government policy development.
Thank you very much, Mary. We have two additional questions. One is for the EU. So what concrete actions is the EU taking to increase youth participation and empowerment in policy formulation? And then this is a question from Agata Sobiech. And then we have another question, and whoever in the panelists wants to respond, I'll be supportive. A question from James Slow. How can we create spaces for young people to deliberate on key issues? So I suggest we start with the questions to Florencia.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, even if you see me. I hope that in the EU, maybe without videos better. In the EU, we do believe as well in youth engagement in policy making, and we have a tool for that called the EU Youth Dialogue. This is an ongoing dialogue, especially for young people, that we run in cooperation with international youth organizations and platforms in each of the member states. How does it work? Together with the youth organizations and the ministries of the countries involved, we define a topic and we send out questionnaire support to run nationally consultations, debates, be online or can be focus group discussion from youth experts who can help them to draw up the questionnaires or have focus group discussions to ensure that everyone can be included. Because what we learned is one tool works for one group of young people, but if you want to be inclusive, you have to offer a toolkit of different methods and ways of engaging to get a more diverse feedback back. And then we will discuss these outcomes of the discussions in youth conferences that we have every 6 months with young people. And together we draw up reports and outcomes, and then these are being landed on the tables of the Council of Youth Ministers in the EU. And we ask them, we invite them to take position on it, to take these home and to act upon that. And this, of course, comes on top of all the other citizens consultation methods and tools that we have. But this one is dedicated for youth. And we're very proud to say that in each of these cycles, we have over 50,000 of young people representing with a fairly diverse outcome. So there is information, if you Google us, EU Youth Dialogue, you can find out more.
Thank you very much. Is any of the panelists willing to take the second question? How can we create spaces for young people to deliberate on key issues? Maybe Massier?
Thank you very much. I was wondering precisely whether the space that young people are claiming, whether this could come together in the interaction with the older persons. I know that this is maybe not very well known yet, even within the European Union, but we had in 2012 the European Year on Active Aging and Intergenerational Solidarity. That was a moment where this discussion on how to bring the two generations and in the policy making, how create space for interaction of different actors from different age cohorts was given. Also, what exists at the European level is the European Day on Intergenerational Solidarity. It's every year on the 29th of April. Again, it's probably not publicized enough, but Age Platform Europe, every year we make all our efforts to use this opportunity precisely to give the space not only to our member organizations, not only to older people, but to have a genuine interaction with young people. And I do take also all the comments made in the chat, which refers, for example, to the difficulty to access education, the cost incurred of education, the question of unpaid internships. All these issues, I think, they must be taken by all the stakeholders around the table. I would even use this word. It's a moral obligation of all of us as policymakers, civil society, researchers, youth organizations to sit together around the table and recognize what are the, let's say, main gaps for young people to just start their life. Because as I said in my earlier intervention, actually, we have to prevent inequalities at the earliest possible stages of life. Otherwise, young people of today or young people of tomorrow, they will become excluded or poor older people even later on.
Thank you very much. We'll take the last two questions and with responses not beyond 30 seconds because we're behind. The first one is from Sharia Walker. What would be some actionable steps for development organizations to embrace meaningful engagement with youth that might come in the form of disruption and works to understand root causes? Maybe Alexandra, you want to take that one very briefly?
Of course, yes. I think disruption is a great word that we hear a lot lately with the importance of innovation and the importance of entrepreneurship. We understand as ISIC that entrepreneurial skill set is one that young people really need to meaningfully step into the labor market, to be contributors in jobs, is the ability to be entrepreneurial and tend to find new ways to do the same work we've done for a long time. And so I think governments, institutions, different stakeholders, creating formal processes to both equip young people with the skills to be entrepreneurs and to support and fund entrepreneurial initiatives. I think that's something really important to consider in our youth engagement frameworks and strategies. Many times young people do have these ideas and they're not waiting. They're creating their own initiatives. They're creating their own solutions to the problems the world faces. And how can we, in a institutionalized way, identify, fund, upscale, give the capacity needed to those initiatives to make an impact on society. So I think looking at the existing creativity, innovation, disruption that young people bring and seeing how we can scale it up and formalize it, that would be the way to start looking at that.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And maybe, so last question from Emmanuel Benz. I think this is probably a question from Mary. Young people and their need for partying seem to become a scapegoat while looking for easy explanations for the second wave of COVID. How can we make clear that this is not a question of young versus old, but reasonable versus unreasonable?
So I missed the very first part of the question, young people and their need for?
Partying, having parties at night.
Oh, partying, right. Yes, it's a good question. In New Zealand, the public communications was around being a team of 5 million and not letting the side down. And by and large, that worked. It did foster that intergenerational solidarity, that we're all in this together. We're in an island together. We're marooned. No one else is going to help us. We have to help each other. And the power of peer pressure, by and large, helped. I suppose, support the behaviours that, that the government was seeking through that public health kind of campaign. Of course, there were outliers, and there were outliers of all generations actually, and they were, I guess, mostly dealt with by, again, by peer response. The police decided very early on they wanted to take a very light touch, sort of educative approach, not be heavy-handed about this, because particularly as lockdown continued and people did get frustrated, and so there was a degree of tolerance for minor sort of departures from the rules, but by and large it was actually that sense of we need each other to be good corporate citizens here. And that kind of got us through, and to date anyway, New Zealand has had a more fortunate situation than others, in that we are able to party again to some extent at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mary. Massier, maybe you want to say something about that?
Very difficult question, because I can absolutely understand the frustration of young people in this current context. At the same time, I think there is also some sort of simplification when we talk about exactly whom we should protect, who is vulnerable in the COVID, and who can basically skip, let's say, the security measures. When we look, of course, older people with all underlying health conditions, they are at a higher risk, but also there are young people with some health conditions which also put them at a risk of COVID. So here, I think it's simply, I mean, it's a moment of a common responsibility. It's a moment where people of all different ages, they are making efforts respectively. And I'm not here to making any judgment who is making more effort. I think the COVID showed, and I think this is extremely positive. It was, for me, the first time since a long time when we could see that solidarity in between different population groups and ages actually can work. Both groups have shown, I think, enormous generosity towards each other. Older people, they were to the possible extent trying, for example, grandparents just to give some respite online to their sons and daughters who were exhausted by care responsibilities. At the same time, young people, they took the phone, they called their grandparents, they brought groceries to their lonely neighbors. They volunteered as well to help older people in the community. So all this showed that actually there is an understanding in between generations, that we are in a very peculiar situation. Here, nobody is actually safe. Let's say our well-being is at stake regardless of our age. And if this brings this additional burden by stopping partying for a while, I know it's hard, but life is can be fun. It can be also sometimes more difficult. It's part of our life story. We will all remember this time for a long time, but I'm sure that actually we will get out of the COVID stronger and with even stronger cooperation and understanding in between different age groups.
Thank you very much. We're a little bit behind, so I will be very short. I mean, we're opening this new part of the webinar this morning on the way forward. Let me thank, first of all speakers here and all panelists. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. This is a very passionate debate. And I think the OECD has a specific role to play in making this debate more objective, more actionable, based on data, facts, evidence. This is our core mission. so that we can all define, an actionable way forward on something that is very passionate by nature. So thank you all, thank you very much. I would like to invite Miss Grace O'Regan, who's the Assistant Principal Officer in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in Ireland. Grace has also a leading role in the OECD as a member of the Bureau of the Public Governance Committee, so reflecting on also how the OECD can help, how the OECD can support this agenda further. We've just opened with our report, but we hope to engage further in this area in the future. That we think we're at a turning point on the issue of youth engagement and participation in civic society. So Grace, now you have the floor. You'll be closing. Thank you very much for coming as well, and please, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Elsa, and good morning, everybody, and good evening. Good very early morning, Alexandra in Canada, and good evening, Marie in New Zealand. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I'd like to welcome this report. I think it's a milestone report. I think it comes at a very interesting time. The work started, I got involved in the development of this report. Ireland did a pilot survey that led then to the wider surveys back in 2018. So it was pre-COVID. We were talking about post-financial crisis, where young people were positioned in terms of the impact of that crisis. The Secretary-General referred that to their positioning already at that stage in terms of the impact of on unemployment, on life chances. So COVID has since hit, and it has thrown it has put a brighter light on the situation for young people and the issues of trust. This report is really interesting because it draws together the evidence, the data, and it shows that there is a link between public governance and youth and trust, and that's quite powerful. Some of the data you mentioned, Elsa, over the course of the panel discussion, that youth are more satisfied with government once they have been included, and that countries with lower levels of age-related inequalities have higher levels of life satisfaction. There are really interesting insights coming through this report, and there's really the value for countries and for decision makers, policy makers, for everyone who has a voice and should have a voice in these discussions, is that we can take a step back and, through the objective work that the OECD has done, look at what is working, where there are gaps, where there may be opportunities to develop our policies further. This has been a really interesting panel discussion. I'm struck by a number of things that all our panelists have said. Putting citizens at the centre of our work, and obviously today we're focusing on youth, we're focusing on elderly. A number of the panelists said important things, I think, relating to this. Princess Laurentien was mentioning about the importance of listening to voices of our citizens. And Alexandra talked about the need for meaningful engagement and authentic engagement. Marie was talking about the importance of the institutional mechanisms so that you're giving people, young people, a real voice as part and putting them at the centre of decision making. Likewise, in Ireland, we have our national strategy on children and young people's participation in decision making that is linked through horizontally, vertically across government departments, from youth at the local level and right up to the highest decision making levels. And this is significant in terms of actually giving youth an authentic voice. And again, looking through the report, there's many other examples of where it's been done well in countries and what's working. And that's a valuable resource for anyone coming to the topic and trying to understand, okay, how can we move forward in this? And in terms of identifying there's a need to move forward, that's coming across very strongly in the discussions. The Secretary-General talked about the need for governments to understand the impact of their policies, and that more needs to be done to address intergenerational justice. Princess Laurentien described the need for an emancipation movement on this. Age, our colleague from Age Platform Europe talked about the moral obligation we now have. We understand the issues, and youth have been very strong in putting their voice forward on this and in prompting wider society and decision makers to look at these mega trends, these longer term issues. They've been raised over the course of this discussion: climate change, the impact of aging societies. Another interesting aspect of the conversation has been addressing the inequalities and embracing diversity. And some of the speakers mentioned, inequalities between, age groups, depending on levels of, and COVID has driven this, and like other surveys that have been done within Europe and around the world. In Ireland, we have been looking at the impact of COVID. We've conducted consultations with young people. One was published recently on How's Your Head, what the response to COVID is. But I was interested to hear some of the findings from the other surveys also that are showing that, there is an impact, and the impact isn't, it needs to be understood, and there needs to be disaggregation of groups within society to really understand what the impacts of the different groups are. But that links back to something I think our Age Platform colleague said about, we need to look at what unites us, because we're looking into a shared future together, and ensuring that the voices are listened to in an authentic way is critical to this. We're all part, I think Prince Laurentien talked about, we're all part of our community, and we also need to understand, as our Age Platform colleague was saying, the different perspectives, the different sensitivities that people might have, depending on, their background and their perspective. But that's an important starting point within this. So in terms of the way forward, the OECD have done us all a great service, I think, by producing this valuable report. I'd like to acknowledge the great work of Miriam Alman and Maurice Alder in the production of the report. I think it throws a light on the path we are currently on, and enables us to step back and have a better understanding of where that path might lead us, and gives us pause for thought to consider, okay, longer term issues, how we've been dealing with, these policy challenges up to now. And COVID brings a lot of these questions into sharp focus. The Secretary-General addressed the fact that there is a question mark at the end of the title of the report, Fit for All Generations. I think this panel has given us the opportunity today to explore that question. And certainly from my perspective on the public, as the Irish delegate on the Public Governance Committee and on the Bureau, I think Alexandra mentioned this is the start of a conversation. Let's continue this conversation. The report shows the opportunity we now have, the possible way forward that we may choose to take. But through the PGC, we will certainly be looking to see how we can explore these issues and progress them further. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and really interesting discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. We're now closing this webinar. Let me thank again all of you, all panelists, all participants. I would also like to thank the team in charge of those who have organized this seminar, who have done the research, Miriam and Moritz, under the leadership of Martin Forst as well, and the whole team. Thank you again, and we'll continue this conversation, as Grace just said. Thank you so much. Just one thing I must to report again, the report itself is available on the OECD iLibrary, where you will also find the highlights documents. And that's it for today. Thank you again, everybody, and see you soon.